I think one way to think of a king is to think of a kind of everyman raised to a height. The old tragedies would deal with kings mostly, and not ordinary men, because kings were considered to be extraordinary, but sort of representatives of humanity, the best of humanity, but sometimes the worst. As we read about King Saul, the first of Israel's kings, we will see both the best and the worst of humanity in Saul. My heart goes out to Saul. He ends up, well, you'll see, you'll read about Saul. I think he's a lot like us. He's been chosen by God, and as you will see, he has trouble getting things right. He keeps falling back on his old patterns of behavior because it's difficult to be chosen by God. In fact, the entire people of Israel are God's chosen people, and they struggle with being faithful to him. A couple other little things I want to point out to you dealing with kings. Here in Psalm 61, which we're reading today, you will prolong the king's life, his years as many generations. He shall abide before God forever. O prepare mercy and truth which may preserve him. And then here at the end of the reading from Isaiah, God is telling second Isaiah what will happen. He will not only restore Israel, the restoration will go above and beyond what anyone is expecting. For I will pour water on the thirsty land and streams on the dry ground. I will pour out my spirit on your offspring and my blessing on your descendants. They will spring up like grass in a meadow, like poplar trees by flowing streams. Some will say, I belong to the Lord. Others will call themselves by the name of Jacob. Still others will write on their hand, the Lord's, and will take the name of Israel. In other words, God is revealing to the second Isaiah that his plan is not just to a king who is God's chosen. In First Samuel, God chooses Saul, but the king represents the chosen people, which has always been the people of Israel, the Hebrews, the Jews. But he reveals, while the Jews are in captivity and suffering, to second Isaiah, that my salvation will be such that everyone will say, I belong to the Lord. I am Israel. I am of the chosen ones of God. I am among God's people, which is what happens with the church. With Jesus, everyone is invited in to the community of the church, to the community that God is revealing his plan to and is sending his Holy Spirit to. So it goes from being in the early chapters, way back in Genesis, it starts with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who becomes Israel, and then the 12 tribes of Israel, and then the nation of Israel. And then through the king as the representative, ultimately it spreads to all the people who say, I am the Lord's, so that God's salvation is more than we would ever expect. But with that in mind, if we are all chosen by God to be members of his people, I would suggest we all tend to be a lot more like Saul than we tend to be like David. David will make his appearance soon in First Samuel, and David serves as a kind of foil or opposite for King Saul. And we see that the mistakes Saul makes, David doesn't make those same mistakes. He makes his own. So let's take a look at Saul and at the whole idea of kingship, and in some ways, the idea of the high priest, which the author of the book of Hebrews is presenting to us as a kind of representative of what we all go through in trying to be loyal to God. So we'll look at that as these stories develop over the next several weeks.